Welcome everybody to this session. My name is Hans Reus. I'm very pleased to see that there's so many of you joining us this evening at the second webinar of the Sustainability Club of the Dutch INSEAD Alumni Association. The program for this evening will be as follows. The first, say, half an hour, I'll have the pleasure to ask some questions to Sandra Pellegrom, whom I will introduce in a moment. And then I'd like to invite you to ask questions as well. Obviously, you're welcome to do that during the first half hour as well, but I will start asking many of those questions in the second half of the program. Everybody will be on mute. This session is being recorded, so that if people make background noise, it doesn't influence the recording. We're very pleased to have our guest this evening, Sandra Pellegrom, who is the SDG coordinator Netherlands at the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She studied journalism and political science later on, and had a very successful career in international diplomacy and policy making. She worked in Bangkok, in Pretoria, in New York, where she was until very recently, until last year, the head of development, humanitarian and human rights department as part of the permanent mission of the Kingdom of the Netherlands to the United Nations. So Sandra, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Let's dive straight into it. You are coordinating the Sustainable Development Goals, also abbreviated as the SDGs. For those perhaps not yet so familiar with the SDGs, what are they? How have they been established, and why are they important?
Well, the 17 goals always sounds quite complicated, but I always say, it's basically a set of issues that are the main issues of our time. And I think it's basically addresses all the policy issues that countries, governments, but also organizations are struggling with. The 17 goals represent actually the basis of our existence, the basis of our economy. A number of goals are about the planet and how we safeguard our natural resources for the future. There's goals about addressing climate change. There's a goal about sustainable water management. We are looking at biodiversity. We're looking at sustainable energy. And we're looking at sustainable production and consumption. And there we get from the planet already into the economic field. So a number of the goals are economic, and you can see them here on your screen. You can see that we're talking about reducing inequalities. We're talking about infrastructure and industry. We're talking about good jobs. And we're also, and then we get to the third sphere that is dealt with by the goals. We're also talking about social well-being, safeguarding our society in such a way that everybody can be part of it, that nobody is left behind. So we're talking about good education, we're talking about no poverty, no hunger, we're talking about good health, very important at this moment in time. So basically this is a plan for a better future, and it encapsulates all the different things that we find important in order to make sure that everybody can have a good life, and also future generations can have a good life.
Wow, that is quite a formidable task, I would say. How did they come about? How were they established? Who provided input?
I think many people have heard of the Millennium Development Goals, a set of 8 goals that the UN set up in 2000 to be achieved by 2015. And it was actually the first time that the UN made such a compact set of very concrete goals. And it was because people had been talking about reducing poverty worldwide for decades, and still we hadn't got there. So the idea arose that if we make some very concrete, brief goals, only 8 of them, and they really look at very basic conditions for human development, very much for developing countries to get out of, the worst poverty, basically. So it was about providing people with drinking water and sanitation. My cat has joined me, by the way. It was about fighting the most severe causes of communicable diseases, such as malaria, but also HIV. It was about reducing poverty, basic access to health and education, very basic goals. And they were for developing countries because all other countries were already at a level where we had reduced these, the worst of poverty. When those goals were actually quite successfully partly achieved towards 2015, a discussion started about, okay, we're quite far, but we're not there yet. But also we're starting to see that, you know, development and reducing poverty is not a linear thing. You know, it's not as if, you know, when you reach a certain point, you will always continue up. I mean, poverty is something that can actually slide if, for instance, a conflict breaks out, if you have increasing inequalities, or if for some reason government has to cut budgets, or we started to see that planetary boundaries and you know, rising climate change effects also have a negative effect potentially on development and can create more poverty. So the realization that if you want to fight poverty long term, you need to look at the planet, you need to look at inequalities, you need to take all these things on board, and you cannot achieve development if you don't also make sure that people's human rights are respected. That led to a discussion about a new set of goals that would be more comprehensive and that would really address both peace, prosperity, planet, and people. So those are the four P's that the agenda tries to address. And the fifth P that we have included is partnerships, because the other innovation in this set of goals was that you know, we realized that governments cannot do this by themselves. This is a task that is so ambitious that every party needs to play their part. Local government, but also NGO, civil society, citizens, young people, and especially also businesses. So it's an agenda that combines all these different things, and it actually also combines all the different existing UN agendas that we already had uh, into one very compact set of, you know, ambitions for the future.
And when you mentioned the private sector, what was the role that the private sector played in establishing these goals? How did they provide input? Because many people might have the impression that this is a UN thing or a government thing, but you clearly say that that's not the case and that the private sector has an important role to play. So curious to see or to find out what role the private sector played in defining these SDGs.
The private sector was very active. Um, I'm not sure if many of you have ever been in a UN negotiation. I spent the last 4 years doing all kinds of negotiations within the UN. Let me tell you, it's a miracle that we got agreement in 2015 on such an ambitious set of goals. It's not something that happens regularly. Usually there's always fighting over all kinds of details, and it's very hard in the UN to be as ambitious as we often would like to be. One of the reasons that this actually worked in 2015 is because the process was taken a little bit out of the regular, as we call it, intergovernmental negotiations. So negotiations between representatives of member governments. There was a very wide input sought from all kinds of parties from around the globe, and especially also from business. Um, and a lot of representatives from business have joined the negotiations, not the negotiations per se, but the conversation that was feeding into the negotiations. There was a consultation in which parties from around the world were able to provide their inputs about what they felt was important to address. And there was different systems in which these different actors could be part of the conversation, and that helped to become more ambitious. So I think it's an excellent example of how we all need each other in order to reach a higher level of ambition. Often we think that the more parties around the table, you know, the less far you can get, because you run the risk of having to deal with, you know, a lowest common denominator situation. But I think reality actually shows the opposite, that where you have more parties around the table and you manage to have a conversation about the interests of everyone, often it turns out that you can go much further than you expected. And the SDGs are an excellent example of that.
Wow, thank you. So the next logical question then is, these goals have been defined and agreed upon some 5 years ago. What progress has the world made in general, and the Netherlands in particular, you know, regarding these goals?
I think, I mean, just maybe to divide between the world and the Netherlands, because I mean, you can imagine that we are quite well off actually in the Netherlands if we look at, you know, where we are in terms of the goals. Worldwide, 2019 September was an interesting moment because that was the first time that the UN member states came back together to review where are we, what is the progress we have made so far. There were a couple of reports produced because that's what we do in the UN, but they were very informative. The UN Secretary General concluded in these reports that, you know, we've made quite a bit of progress, in particular if we look at reducing poverty around the world. But he also noted a couple of strong concerns. And what he said is, you know, what we see is that, yes, we have reduced poverty. And basically from 1990, you know, in 1990, we had a poverty rate, extreme poverty of 36% of the global population. It's huge. And by 2018, this was reduced to 8.6%. But these 8.6 is a difficult one because that's where you get to a point where you have entrenched poverty. And how do you address the people that are in the 8.6%? Those are the hardest to reach. So he said there we have to do more in order to really reach those people that are at risk of being left furthest behind. But he also said, I see rising inequalities worldwide. And I think we all know that if you look at economic growth in the Netherlands, but also worldwide, you see that the growth of GDP has surpassed in most cases the growth of you know, income of the majority of the population. So there is an issue about rising inequalities. We know that, but I mean, the figures also prove it. The other strong concern that the UN expressed is, of course, the planet. Climate change is really not on the right track. Water is not on the right track. I think many people know the issues around climate change. But I remember the first time that I read a report on the global water crisis, I mean, I remember goosebumps, so shocked I was, because the predictions are that even by 2030, we may be facing a situation where we have a 50% shortfall of water against demand. 50% in 2030, that's 10 years from now. And I think we're starting to see this even in the Netherlands with drier and drier summers continuing, you know, year after year. So the planet is a real concern. Biodiversity going backwards, waste a big issue. So those are the issues that the world is facing. The Netherlands is doing pretty well. I mean, there's a couple of global indices where you can see, you know, your ranking worldwide. We're on the 9th spot worldwide in terms of being on the way to achieving the SDGs. So that means we're not there yet, but we're in the 9th place in terms of being, you know, making a lot of progress. But of course, I mean, who do you compare yourself with? Is, you know, I always say we shouldn't be complacent because that means that the whole of Scandinavia is way ahead of us. And that also means that a few other countries like France and Germany that we compare ourselves with are actually also ahead of us. So, you know, there's no reason for complacency. We do have an annual report that the Dutch Statistical Office, the CBS, produces. And it came out just a couple of weeks ago on the 20th of May. So very interesting information because I think this is the last set of data that we have from before the Corona crisis. And it shows that we are pretty resilient as we have a good position. And that also, well, I think the way we are able to deal with the Corona crisis is also because we have that strong basic starting point. But we do have a couple of challenges. In particular, I mean, the planetary goals is also an issue for the Netherlands. So especially goal 7, which encourages us to move to renewable energy sources. Yes, we're making progress. The trend is positive in the sense of we're moving faster towards the goal. But in a European perspective, we're still at the bottom of the list because other European countries who were ahead of us are also continuing to make progress. Another issue is climate change action. Yes, we're making progress because we have done a lot over the past years to, to strengthen our ambition, but we're still not ahead of the curve. We're still, in European perspective, one of the, the bottom list countries. And are we going fast enough? Biodiversity is also a big issue. We're losing biodiversity year by year, and we're not doing enough to stop it. And another one very interesting is gender equality. We're not doing very well in the Netherlands. We are having some positive trends, good trends, but still somewhere in the middle on the European rankings. And worldwide, I think we're on the 39th spot or something like that in the World Gender Index. That is not something that we should be proud of, I think. So quite a few things that we need to work on. If people have time or questions, I can tell you more about the different things that we see. But in any case, just to say that, we have challenges and we need to be alert. And we also need to continue year on year to monitor ourselves, because we are actually doing pretty well in terms of poverty and reduced inequalities in a European perspective, really at the top of the list. But also in the Netherlands, these trends are negative. So there's a risk that, that we're slipping. And we do need to pay attention in order to be still on track to reach that goal in 10 years.
We as INSEAD people like to understand what the underlying barriers are. I understand that the topics are very different, be it biodiversity or gender equality and the likes, but having been in your role for about a year, what would you say are the key barriers that we in the Netherlands need to overcome, perhaps specifically focusing on the private sector?
That's a very good question. I think the problem is that there's not a lack of enthusiasm around the goals. There's a lot of enthusiasm, especially also in the private sector, because companies see that it's a very helpful agenda to think through what your impact as a company is. It's not an easy one, though. I think if you're a business, you really need to take the time to analyze your processes, your business operations, but also your value chains against these SDGs. And I mean, that's something that you need to invest time in order to understand it. And then also invest time in order to see, okay, where can I make a difference? Often this also requires, actual investments money-wise in terms of changing certain processes, making sure that you pay good wages or that your suppliers abroad pay good wages, invest maybe in water and energy efficient machinery. But I always say, I think, you know that at some point you're going to have to do this anyway, because operating as a business with the SDGs in hand, that's the way that businesses of the future will be required to operate. So it's a good time to invest in that. And people say often, well, we're very stretched now with Corona and recovering from the crisis. And I really do understand that. And I also see that it might not be possible for everyone. But if you have to rethink your model as a business, I think it's always worthwhile to see how you can recover from the crisis in a way that is more future-proof. And future-proof, I think, is really about green sustainability and about social sustainability, and about understanding that businesses have a wider role in society than just making profit, and that this is the way that businesses will get recognition and will get a license to operate in the future. And businesses that have done that, also in international value chains, they often tell us that actually that has made them more resilient against the crisis, like Corona, for instance. I spoke with people involved in the textile industry, and they were saying that, we can really see that those businesses who over the past years have invested in a more socially viable value chain. So working with decent wages, investing in the employees in developing countries, making sure that you have, long-term relations instead of very short-term, cheapest product-based behavior, but long-term behavior, investing in each other. That those relationships and the investment that they have done in the people, that actually made them more resilient to weather the crisis like this. And those businesses that were short-term gain oriented have not been able to survive in many cases the crisis. So I think it's worthwhile. If you can, I would advise to try and do it. I mean, there's a number of other things I can say about obstacles that we see globally in terms of achieving the SDGs. That's more about SDG financing and how do you design innovative financing models? How do you govern for the SDGs? But we can also leave those for questions.
Got it. Thank you. Let's switch gears to the role of the government. What regulation can we expect from either the Dutch government or at the European level? For instance, the Green Deal. What regulation do you think will come our way, and how can we best deal with that? You're on mute, Sandra.
Sorry. I think there's a very interesting conversation ongoing about corporate social responsibility and how much does it need to be obligatory and how much of it voluntary. As you probably know, in the Netherlands, we've made a lot of progress over the past years in voluntary approaches. There have been a lot of encouragements from government to work with the OECD guidelines for corporate for responsible business conduct. And the government has supported quite a number of sectors to design covenants around more sustainable sourcing. Those are excellent examples that we have also brought into the European discussion, and government has also very much encouraged the European Union to also look at those type of examples, because of course this works better if you have a level playing field with other European countries. Now with the new European Commission launching the Green Deal and really looking at the SDGs broader as a compass for their policies, there's quite a bit of discussion going on at the European level. I cannot predict yet where that will go, but you see a very strong ambition with this commission to push for SDG-based operations, to push for greening the European economy. The Green Deal itself, of course, is full of those type of proposals. And the EU is also establishing a number of funds that should help this transition to a more green and a climate neutral economy. So I think that will definitely help. But also in terms of legislation from Europe, I mean, there's a proposal for a European climate legislation. So that'll, I think, create some more obligations. But there's also a process ongoing that is looking into revising the existing European directive about non-financial reporting by companies. And that'll definitely help. And I mean, the idea of the European Commission is, of course, to strengthen that, to strengthen the obligations for businesses to report on non-financial issues, environmental issues, social issues. And that, I think, will provide a big drive for companies to have more clarity as to, what issues do we need to report on? And the issues you need to report on, I mean, are obviously the issues that you need to work on. So that's a very good development. The other thing is recently the EU launched a European taxonomy that gives us more clarity as to what exactly is sustainability if you talk about investment. So that'll give us a good push towards more towards a movement in the capital markets, from the investment side towards sustainable investment. Once this European taxonomy gives an idea as to what is it that we can call sustainable, it will become also an encouragement for investors to look for those type of investments that are sustainable. And I think that also for businesses is an important one to realize. I mean, it's worthwhile investing in being a sustainable company because increasingly it will give you opportunities to tap into these funds that are looking around in the capital markets for sustainable investment. So I think, you know, these developments will definitely put us on a path of more sustainable capital markets and more sustainable economy. So again, as a business, I think it's just good sense to invest in that. Of course, a lot of this is about green sustainability, but there's quite a lot of attention also about social sustainability. So social aspects, good wages, workers' rights, also in your chain in other countries. And of course, what we are stimulating is to look wider at the SDGs as a basis for, you know, for defining what corporate social responsibility is.
Thank you. Do you have any advice, especially for the the more advanced SDG specialists in the room who'd like to use the Sustainable Development Goals as a business opportunity? Do you have any best practices from industries that you've visited? Any things you think are really helpful and good for other companies to copy?
There's quite a few leaders in the industry, and you see that a lot of companies are using the SDGs. They are on different stages in terms of how far they have been able to integrate the SDGs into their policies. I won't name the name of a company, but recently I saw an excellent example of a company working on how do you call that in English? Foodstuffs, I would say. So all kinds of what's the word in English?
In Dutch?
Stoffen.
Food ingredients, components?
Ingredients, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, ingredients that are used in all different kinds of food industries. And they have really looked at their chain with the SDGs and said, okay, how can we make our production processes more natural? So less chemical, more natural, and less polluting. So that means that they pollute less, but they also actually increase the health of the end consumer, and they enable the companies that they supply to produce healthier and more sustainable products as well. They've also looked at possibility of designing new products that do exactly this, that are careful with biodiversity, that are more healthy, that use good products, and that look at the way that things are produced. So I think in that sense they're really sort of designing better products that they can sell better by having an eye for these SDGs, for the environment. Another company that I met a while ago is a cleaning company, and they have really looked at, they said, okay, we're working on SDG 8, decent jobs. I mean, we're giving people decent jobs. But then looking at the SDGs and also SDG 10, how can you reduce inequalities? How can you provide better chances to more people? And how can you be a more diverse company? Because diverse teams actually have been proven to provide better results. They said, okay, we already provide good wages and good jobs, but can we do better? Inspired by this SDG 10 of reducing inequalities. So they designed an academy for young people with a very low education in order to educate them to be a specialized cleaner in hospitals, which is a very important job. I mean, in a hospital, and I mean, the COVID crisis has only reinforced that. It's a very specialized type of cleaning that you really need to get good training in. And that provides these young people with a lot of pride and good, a good starting point that actually allows them also to progress and to make a career out of this. They also invested in hiring people with a distance to the labor market, or people with mental or physical disabilities. Because they saw that there's a number of jobs that they have in-house that are actually excellent, and that people can be just part of the company, not put away in a little room where you can do this little thing, but actually bringing these people into the mainstream of the company. And he said it's been such a positive energy that was brought into our company. It's really made us grow, and it has enabled us to get a number of contracts because we can prove that we are a company with a positive impact on the SDGs.
Fantastic. I'd like to ask one more question before we open up the floor to the participants. So please start firing your questions in the chat box. You mentioned the Corona crisis. What opportunities could the Corona crisis provide to entrepreneurs? We have a number of entrepreneurs in this call. Have you seen other examples in addition to the cleaning company you just mentioned, of opportunities that could be of interest to the people around in this group? For instance, we looked at Drawdown in the last webinar, which was a fantastic list of climate change projects. Any other opportunities or best practices you'd like to share would be very welcome.
To be honest, specific for Corona, I haven't really met companies that have done that, except for the ones that we've all seen in the media, where companies have. Well, maybe I did see one. I think there's a company that that has made a business out of using old clothing. Whether it is your shirt, as men always throw away their shirt, and I think it's also boxer shorts that they actually reuse and redesign, or they make your shirts into boxer shorts or something like that. But they also use old professional uniform type of clothing, or safety clothing by companies, and they make it into bags and into all kinds of interesting things, furniture, and they actually started producing mouth masks, of course. And you see a number of other companies that have been, working with cloth material that actually started to produce mouth masks. So that is an example. But I think it's for every country, for every company itself, a good exercise to sit down, to look at these SDGs and to be inspired and to think, okay, what else can I do? And maybe some things that I'm doing now I cannot do in the crisis, but are there other things that I could do? One opportunity that I see, and I think we all see, is that the one positive effect of the crisis has been the reduction in pressure on the environment. And many people are saying we want to continue to work in a way that is less of a burden on the environment. Can we work more from home? How do we deal with meetings? How do we continue to breathe fresher air like we have now? I think it would be very helpful for companies to start thinking of ways that we can do this. I mean, we know these type of meetings that we're having now is a good solution, but people also sometimes want to meet each other. I'm sure there must be innovative ways that we can keep the positive effect on the environment and work differently than we used to, but still in a slightly more innovative way than we're doing now, sitting at home and looking at our screen. I cannot think of it. That's why I'm a civil servant and not an entrepreneur, but I'm sure you guys are able to think of innovative ideas. And the other thing that I would really encourage is, and I think that's also something that many organizations are encouraging the governments to do, is be very careful in the recovery that we don't jump back into our old habits that create a lot of CO2, that are wasteful with water, that damage biodiversity. We really need to use this crisis to move to a more sustainable system, because otherwise, what we might see is that we have a slight positive effect of the crisis on environmental goals now, but the potential negative effect once we start recovering from the crisis, the potential negative effect on reaching the climate goals, reaching the water goals, reaching the biodiversity goals, reaching the renewable energy goals, the potential negative effect is huge if we jump back and we just try to recover as fast as possible without looking at the environment. We might slide back so much further than we would have without the crisis. And that is something I think we should all really keep in the forefront of our heads and try to avoid at all cost.
There's a number of questions coming in from the audience, so thank you for doing that. One of the questions I'd like to single out is, do you see an increasing pressure on other large players in the world, the US, China, India, Brazil, to play their part? Because there's only so much we can do as the Netherlands, of course.
Yes, I think the pressure is there, but we all know that that might not be the countries that will take the lead in this. I think waiting for others is never a good solution. I'm not denying that that is an issue and that you would like these countries to step up, and they are the biggest ones, and they do have a lot of effect, in particular on climate change and on biodiversity. At the same time, waiting and for others without doing anything, I mean, that has two problems. First of all, it's this, we're in a car and it's heading towards the ravine. You can wait for somebody else to stop it, but it would be better to join forces with all the other people in the back of the car to stop it than to wait for those two big ones in the front. Secondly, I think you miss a lot of opportunities if you wait for others, because I think those that are starting, or you should have started already, but the countries that are ahead of the curve now and cooperating with other countries on this are the ones that are on the path to the future. So you'd rather be one of the first ones than lag behind, I think.
Got it. Another question is, here's someone who is working for UNDP in Zambia in Southern Africa. And that individual says, I can on a daily basis see the devastating effect of COVID-19 on pretty much all of the SDGs.
Yeah.
Are the SDGs being revisited? Are the goals lowered in any way in order to achieve them in 2030?
No, I don't think you should definitely not lower your goals, because I mean, what would that do? That would make us less ambitious. Are we going to do a lottery which people are not entitled to a good life? I think it's a real danger, and I think the UN has also said that half of the workforce globally is at risk of losing their job. Poverty is potentially, I think the World Bank estimated that 40 to 60 million people are at risk of sliding back into poverty, and that will set us back about 30 years if we don't watch out. So I think the answer is cooperation and investment. I think our Prime Minister said in a UN or an international meeting, UN meeting a couple of weeks ago, that we also need to look very carefully at debt burdens of developing countries and make sure that the debt burden is not a hindrance to recovery. But we also need to continue investing, and well, I cannot really say much about it, but there's a clear request also from my minister, Minister Kaag, to also continue investing in developing countries, and to also see that that's an investment in ourselves in the end. The UN Secretary General said a couple of weeks ago that Corona clearly shows that we are as weak as the weakest health system in the world. So it is also in our own interest to continue investing in other countries. But yeah, it's a big risk, and I'm not sure. I hope that we all see that, and that we will strengthen our investment.
Got it.
And I think business actually can play a big role in that, because I think there is truth in that development assistance is important, but you can achieve so much more by investing in these countries and having local production over there and be a good employer in a developing country. I mean, that's probably the biggest impact worldwide that you can have as a company.
Got it. Could you tell us a little bit more about the SDG Action Manager, which was launched earlier this year? That's one of the questions from the audience, and how that is dealt with by the corporate world.
To be honest, perhaps is somebody in the room who's actually involved in the SDG Action Manager. Is that the SDG Action Manager by B Corp that we're talking about?
It was launched by Lisa Kingo and Katie Hill. Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's a number of really good instruments out there that businesses can use. We are at the moment I mean, we're working with a consultant who's writing a report for us as a government on different SDG impact instruments and tools that are out there, because we felt that there's quite a bit on the market, and we'd like to see what is there, so that we can also make it easier for businesses to see, okay, where do I start, right? What is what? And also, what is the comparability between the different instruments? And I think that will hopefully help businesses also to have a better overview of, what are entry-level instruments, if I just want to start, have a quick scan, and what are instruments that will help me go deeper and to really look at all the different processes that I have. And from what I've seen, the SDG Action Manager is one of those that help to really delve deeply into your processes. The problem is I've tried to open it myself, but since I'm not a business, I can't actually see what it does. So
Got it.
I know what it does because it's been explained to me, but I wanted to go into it, but I'm not a business, so I couldn't.
And then there's a number of people here in this chat box that ask for career advice. I think it's fair to say that that lots of people would like to have a bigger impact on the Sustainable Development Goals than they have presently in their current jobs.
Yeah.
Do you have any career advice for these people? Should they stay in the private sector and move to the
Stay.
public sector?
I think, all of you in the private sector, you are all a force for change. And I think the biggest impact that we see is at the moment from the private sector, and from those people that stick their necks out and that say, okay, I don't care, I'm just going against the wind. I am just going to make sure that we do this in my company. And because I know it's right, and because I know it's beneficial. The one advice that I would give, because it's quite similar to what we are trying to do in the central government, I think, if you want to get people to, it's easy to get people enthusiastic about these goals because they're very clear and understandable, and everybody embraces them when they see them. But the next step is really to help people to understand why and how it's useful to apply them in your actual daily work. How do they apply to what I do on a day-to-day basis, and to the demands that I have, the KPIs I have? How do I actually use these goals to make those better and to be more effective in what I'm asked to do in my regular job? And we always say, there's from the government side, what we tell our colleagues is that if you use these goals, it'll give you a tool to have a more complete overview of where your effects are, whether they are negative or potentially positive. This will help you to be more effective. It'll help you to be more efficient if you can sort of look at that, and it'll help you to have a positive impact in society. It also helps you to see the linkages between different goals. And I think that is very important in government, because we are dealing with very complex issues where everything has an effect on everything. And we need to use these sustainable development goals to have a coherent policy and to have attention for all these different elements that potentially might undercut something else that we're trying to do, but also have a potential to give us fantastic win-win type of solutions if we manage to find a way to, to have a synergetic approach. I think this latter point might also apply to businesses, where if you try to look further than the narrow thing that you're trying to do, but see where there might be linkages to other goals that you can achieve in the same goal, you might run into really interesting win-win type of solutions. Or you might, see different partners that you hadn't thought of, and that that might create some type of innovation that you haven't seen before. And I think this is necessary because the issues are very complex, and we need really, really innovative solutions. So I think that you can really play a big role in business on that. But nevertheless, if you want to come to government, I like it. I mean, please do. But I think business is a very important sector that can make a huge difference.
Got it. And on that note, of the SDGs being interlinked, one of the questions also in the chat box is, have you seen examples of organizations or companies that are very honest about reporting not just the 3 or 4 SDGs that they've singled out and that they're really, focusing their marketing efforts on, but they're also at the same time very honest about the perhaps negative or detrimental effect they may have on the remaining SDGs? Do you know
No, I
examples
think
of
that
companies
is,
that do both?
yeah, I think that is exactly, if once you do that, then you've internalized the thinking, because it's very important, like you said, to also analyze your potential negative effect, because only in doing that you will be able to mitigate those effects, or at least be honest about them, and to sort of take that into consideration. Examples of companies, I think ABN AMRO might be one of those, because they won a prize recently for the most transparent reporting. And that's interesting, because that's a prize handed out also by the Ministry of Economic Affairs that encourages transparent reporting also on non-financial issues. It doesn't award your impact. It doesn't award you because you've had the best impact in the world, but it awards companies who have been most transparent about their impact, whether it be positive or negative.
Got it. All right. Next questions. What could you say something about the financial models around the SDGs? It's one thing to to use them for marketing purposes and cost savings, as some people have been, some companies have been doing. But are there financial models, subsidy models, government support one way or the other that businesses can benefit from?
Well, there's a number of government instruments for businesses, including instruments that are supporting businesses to trade or to invest in other countries. And those instruments are now streamlined along the SDGs. And one of the requirements in order to be able to use these instruments is always adhering to the OECD guidelines on responsible business conduct. We are working with colleagues to clarify better for businesses how responsible business conduct and the SDGs are linked. I think the OECD guidelines on responsible business conduct are basically a behavioral guideline, and the SDGs are then specific goals that help you to make more specific, what your contribution is. So we're trying to work on, some kind of way that we can make that easier to understand for businesses and also easier to work with. I think the EU is moving towards a number of these instruments. The Just Transition Fund that is related to the Green Deal is likely to also have, we don't know that yet, but I can imagine that the SDGs are also going to come into play in terms of criteria. The discussion in the Dutch financial sector has started with attention for climate risks and defining climate risks in investment, slowly moving towards biodiversity risks. So I think there's also an interest there to start, expanding the scope of, what type of risks do we need to analyze if we talk about long-term investment that is safe. And I think the SDGs are of interest. They're not in there yet, but might get there at some point. So there's a lot of things happening. So I'm pretty sure that doesn't answer the question completely, but maybe the person who asked it could otherwise be a bit, elaborate a little bit more.
Okay. One other question is about the small and medium-sized enterprises. In the press, we read on a daily basis mainly on the larger companies in the Netherlands, but you could argue that the small, medium-sized enterprises are the driver of innovation and growth and employment as well. Do you have any specific advice for people active in those smaller companies who are trying to survive, innovate, but also deal with the Corona crisis at the same time?
Yeah, I think the biggest advice is don't give up, and don't be deterred by the first look at the SDGs might seem that it's too much, too complicated. Start small. I think every company can have a look at these goals and just quickly, even with a pencil, say, okay, I'm working on this. I mean, every company is already working on SDG 8 because you're always employing people. And then you can have a look at, okay, do I pay good wages? Do I know anything about, where in other countries my products come from? Are my suppliers good employers? And you don't have to always immediately answer all those questions, but you can often quickly make a scan and say, okay, so these are things that are relevant for me, even if I don't have the information yet. And then you can see which of these goals are the ones that I have the strongest impact on, and start with those. And then you work your way through. And at some point, once you start, we see that many also medium-sized and smaller enterprises get very enthusiastic and start to see that they can do more. And it's also nice because you can also start defining what your positive impact on these goals and thereby on society is. So I think it also generates positive energy. And from what I understand, depending on how many employees you have, many companies say that their employees are getting so enthusiastic when they start doing this, because I mean many people do want to work in a company that has a positive impact, and they also would like to know how their specific job in a company does actually contribute to something positive. So I think it also helps to make employees happier, because you can define how, I don't know, maybe the cleaning lady has an impact at some point on society in a positive way.
I've got two final
Or the
questions.
accountant,
Thank you. I've got two final questions before we wrap up. The first one is there a set of additional sources of information that you would recommend us to look into? Obviously, the website around the SDGs, but are there other sources of information? You mentioned the CBS already. Other sources of information that people in this call could tap into and benefit from?
Definitely, if you look at instruments that can support you, look at the RVO, the Government Agency for Support to Business. They're working also to sort of make sure that in each instrument they have a link to the SDGs. I don't think they're there yet, but those are, I think that's a good place to start if you're looking for instruments that can support you as a business, rvo.nl. But I definitely also look at UN Global Compact Netherlands, gcnetherlands.nl or com, NL, I think. That's the network of businesses that are organized around contributing to the UN SDGs. And they are housed in VNO-NCW, but they have a separate governance structure, director, Linda van Beek, and they have a chair, Jan-Willem Schijgrond from Philips. But they also provide seminars, information, training, and so on the SDGs. We're also working with them at times to provide information sessions on the SDGs to SMEs. So that I think is an interesting one, and might be interesting also to consider becoming a member of the UN Global Compact. And that means that you would have to adhere to 10 principles of responsible business conduct. SDG Netherlands is a very interesting and very wide-ranging website. SDG Netherlands is the widest network of all parties in society in the Netherlands that are active around the SDGs. And they have a number of pages also for specific SDGs, listing which other parties in the Netherlands are working on those. I have to be frank, some of these pages are more populated than others. It's a work in progress, but it has a lot of information, also very good information about events coming up. It's SDG Netherlands, SDG Nederland, sdgnederland.nl. And the other thing that is in the course of being set up is that there's a network of locations in the Netherlands that call themselves SDG houses. And several of those are actually impact hub type of things, where you find a lot of social entrepreneurs. The KIT, the Tropical Institute in Amsterdam, is one of them. There's the campus Zonheuvel in north of Utrecht. There's the Social Impact Factory in Utrecht. Museum. There's quite a number of these SDG houses that might be nice and interesting places for businesses to also look for partners, because that's where many of the social entrepreneurs in the Netherlands that are active around the SDGs are working. There's a couple of those social entrepreneurs that are also specifically focusing on SDG financing. For instance, an organization called Social Finance, based in the KIT, the Tropical Institute in Amsterdam, and they're looking at social bonds and those type of things. It might be interesting for smaller companies who are interested in working in these type of partnerships.
Fantastic. That's a lot of information to digest. The final question, as I promised, is there anything we can do for you? We try to make that a habit in these webinars to ask the guests if we can do something in return. You've been very generous with your time. Most of the questions that I just read out started with, thank you, Sandra, for an excellent presentation. I didn't do that all the time, but let me do that here.
Excellent interview, I think, that leads to an excellent presentation.
Is there anything we can do to help you?
Just keep in touch and let me know if you run into interesting examples or if you have questions. But one very specific thing that might be interesting for all of you is to participate and to sign up for the SDG Action Day on the 25th of September. It's an annual event. This year it's going to be electronic or digital, so it'll be also fun, but easier for everybody to participate. It has a plenary program with, one of our ministers will be speaking, but there's also going to be very interesting speakers. But it also has quite a number of different workshops that are, quite a few of them also very interesting, I think, for businesses. And you can sign up on the website of SDG Nederland. But I think it would be great if many of you could participate and bring your knowledge and your questions from the business side into those conversations. Otherwise, I would definitely recommend business to participate in a number of these other transition conversations that you have taking place digitally around the web at the moment. There's the Drift transition conversations of the Transition Institute Drift, very much about, how do we make transitions to a new type of economy? If you're interested in that, might be nice to participate. If you look at Drift, D-R-I-F-T, you will find them. Every Friday afternoon, they have a session. Another conversation that might benefit from business input is the Springtij conversation. A network of influential people that really look at green sustainability. And normally it takes place on Terschelling. I think they're doing it also physically still, but they might be organizing some digital webinars in the run-up to that. So that's also, I think, I think for me, the more people we can involve from different sectors of society in many of these conversations about post-corona recovery, the better it is, because we need to have these conversations not in our own little circle, but across these different communities and really reaching out to each other and to get to a common understanding of what we want the Netherlands and the world to look like in 10 years' time.
And on that positive note, let me thank you once again on behalf of the INSEAD Sustainability Club. Look forward to keeping in touch, and thank you once again for all the time and information you've shared with us.
And thank you all very much for taking the time. It was an excellent occasion, and I'm very happy that that you invited me, Hans, and that you were all so interested and active in the chat. And I hope to keep in touch with many of you.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a nice evening.
Have a good night, everyone.